Breath of the Wild has been a weird case for me over the years. Being the massive Zelda fan that I am, I've wanted to play this for years, ever since it came out, but I hesitated not only because of the money it would cost for me to buy a Switch and play it, but also because I was disappointed to hear that Nintendo had gone with the flow and made it open world, like so many other games seem to be doing these days. This disappointed me not only because I've never been the biggest fan of open world games, but also because it felt like Nintendo was following a trend, where Zelda has always in the past been more of a trend setter rather than a trend follower. I'd also heard that although a great open world game, it wasn't much of a Zelda game in that it doesn't display a lot of the tropes that we have come to expect from Zelda over the years. As you can imagine, this turned me off to the idea of rushing to play it, as inevitable as my eventual playthrough would be. But then, after enjoying Skyrim a lot more than I expected to, I re-evaluated Breath of the Wild and gave it a go. Let me tell you, I should have played this years ago. It is by far and away the best open world experience I've found to date. I actually think it's hard to make a good open world game, as it's too easy to fall into large but boring landscapes where each area is essentially a carbon copy of the last. And if I'm honest, that's what I was expecting. Breath of the Wild manages to provide an enthralling open world with interesting and varied biomes, interesting and believable characters and stories, and an overarching plot that, although quite light on the ground, is sufficient to accompany the open world theme. Movement across the world is incredibly satisfying and never really feels like a chore, with a fast travel mechanic and a frankly genius stroke of a glider. The way the game gradually opens up and is generally split into 5 main areas, sort of, is smart and satisfying to open up. The mechanic of needing certain clothes or food to continue feels somewhat arbitrary, but still works and fits into the theme of the game. The temples, or rather divine beasts, are fantastically crafted, well spread out and well paced, if a tad samey. The overall experience is really top notch in many respects. A few of the complaints I heard about the game prior to playing was that one spends too long in the menus. I can't say I noticed this as a problem. Yes, one does have to change weapons quite frequently, but this can be quick changed using the C buttons. Eating food during fights requires a quick stop in the menu, but unless you're struggling, it's unlikely you're going to need to do this more than once or twice in a decent fight. And even then, the menus are incredibly fast and don't feel much like an interruption to the action. Having said this, I do think that the act of actually cooking the food in the first place is an incredibly time-consuming and often boring chore, which could be streamlined in several ways. First of all, the animation of the food jumping around in the pan every time is frankly just annoying. I know this can be skipped, but it takes almost as long to skip as it does to watch the animation. And to have to do this for every single plate of food, especially towards the end of the game where you're likely to need large amounts of food against harder enemies, is laborious and unfun at best. A menu that just makes the items immediately and allows you to make multiple at the same time would have been far better. Another complaint I heard a lot before going into the game was about how annoying the breaking weapons mechanic is. As much as I can understand how this could be annoying, I have to say this never seemed an issue to me. The game gives warning before a weapon is about to expire to give you an opportunity to inflict extra damage, and the amount of weapons available makes up more than enough for the weapons breaking. It adds an extra element to the combat which honestly would probably be boring without it. I'd have more issues if changing weapons wasn't quick and easy with the C buttons, and if you weren't able to extend your inventory with the Korok seeds. But as it stands, I honestly can't see what all the fuss is about. Finally, a complaint I heard before going in was the overall lack of dungeons. Again, I never saw this as too much of an issue. The open world setting allows the dungeons to essentially be broken up into multiple bite-sized challenges called shrines. Sometimes the challenge was getting into the shrine, sometimes the challenge was posed inside the shrine. This, if anything, allowed a greater variety of challenges and prevented that classic feeling of dungeon fatigue that I know I often feel towards the end of a big dungeon, where I'm just ready for it to end. The dungeons that were provided in the Divine Beasts, while somewhat short and fairly samey, were fun and well crafted and more than scratched the itch for a longer dungeon experience that the shrines lacked. A few complaints I have now that I've played the game is honestly, overall, the combat is weak. There's a lot of scope for awesome moves and styling on enemies, but the base combat is quite repetitive, and honestly, I found the attack cycles of many of the enemies more frustrating than anything. Nowhere is this starker than with the bosses of the dungeons, which have more frustrating mechanics than I'd care to count, and the feeling of finally beating them equated more to relief that it was finally over than triumph. I'm also not entirely a fan of the voice acting overall either. Although I'm happy that they've taken the time and effort to add some, I feel that the voice provided, especially to Zelda, just doesn't fit, and honestly, I found it more grating than anything. In fact, I'd go further and say that I think that Zelda's characterization overall just doesn't work, and she comes across as fairly insufferable, if I'm honest. At no point did I feel any sympathy for her, and at no point during my admittedly fun adventure did I feel like I was acting to help or save her, even though that's technically the point of the game. A stark contrast to Skyward Sword, where I felt a strong compunction to save Zelda as soon as possible. These are two fairly major complaints, but honestly, the rest of the game is so endearing and enthralling that I can forgive these gripes. The combat is a tad repetitive, but it doesn't stop the game from being fun, and the voice acting only pops up occasionally. What you end up with is a beautifully crafted, large open world that is fun and not especially difficult to traverse, with mechanics that only serve to augment and complement the world created. It's also an incredibly smooth game. Usually, open world games are riddled with bugs, but I can safely say that I haven't found a single one in my first playthrough. A rare and special gem amongst open world games. Sure, Breath of the Wild still comes with a $60 price tag, but a premium price tag comes with a premium experience. A balanced, well-made, and beautiful open world game that you will be happy to sink many, many hours into. And to the people that say that it isn't a Zelda game, that's an interesting one. It's true that a lot of the tropes that we have come to rely on in Zelda are gone with Breath of the Wild. The dungeons aren't exactly traditional, and you don't get an item in each dungeon. The linear story progression is gone, and a lot of the classic dynamic between the characters just isn't there. But the thing is, the magic of Zelda is still here. The excellent gameplay, the Triforce, the princess and the hero, the essence of Zelda still very much exists within Breath of the Wild. So is it a Zelda game? Absolutely. Is it a great Zelda game? It sure is. Would it still have been a great game if you stripped it of the Zelda IP? Well, yes. But you could say that about any of the Zelda games. Having said that, I would be a lot happier if the next Zelda game returns more towards the old formula than stays with this one. Yeah, it was fun to step away from the formula for one game, but a permanent departure would be nothing short of a tragedy, especially for a long-time franchise fan like me. In a way, it has similarities to Zelda 2, in that it was a, hopefully temporary, departure from what makes the series great. It just so happens that in Breath of the Wild's case, they actually made a great game. And on the subject of it feeling like Nintendo were just following a trend, as true or false as that may be, Breath of the Wild isn't just a cookie-cutter open-world game. It's its own unique and fantastic experience that Nintendo have very much punched their own stamp and brand on. In many ways, I feel like Breath of the Wild defines open-world games rather than falls in line behind others, in the same way that Skyrim did when it came out. If anything, it shows Nintendo going out of their comfort zone, changing genre in arguably their most loved IP, and taking a chance on something new. And lord did it pay off. I can't really speak for the replayability of the game, but I can tell you that my first playthrough was pretty close to magical. It was like being a kid again, exploring the world and gradually peeling away the layers until there was nothing left. I literally spent hours just exploring and didn't feel like my time had been wasted. I love this game, and it becomes a must-play for both fans of open-world games and fans of the Zelda franchise. So, unless you dislike both open-world and Zelda, I cannot recommend Zelda Breath of the Wild enough.